Thank you very much, Becky. I'll just get rid of "got it" there. And I'd like to issue a warm welcome to all of you. Over the past year, we've had Nature Nova Scotia has 10 new groups that have joined us, and thanks to individuals like you, Nature Nova Scotia has become a stronger voice for, guess what, nature. This celebration of nature's weekend schedule of speakers offers a virtual opportunity to become much better informed about many species of Nova Scotia's ecology, and our in-person outdoor events, which is a pleasant change, scheduled all over the province, will provide local opportunities to learn and share while socializing safely. And I'm so happy about that. And I'm also very happy about the fact that there's still a lot of nature to celebrate in Nova Scotia. We're most fortunate. 3 days ago, a male Canada warbler, a beautiful species at risk, spent time in dogwoods I planted a couple of years ago, and I was about a meter away, very still. And last night an otter was playing in the pond below our house while barred owls hooted nearby. It's a joy to experience nature for me, and it's something about soothing the soul that fits in, I think, probably with all of you. I want to especially thank Becky Parker and her Nature Nova Scotia coordinator for stick handling a very unruly website. I hope you all haven't had too much trouble getting going here tonight, and we hope the rest of the weekend. It wasn't the way it was supposed to be. But I want to thank you again for attending our celebration. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, David Patriquin. David has a PhD in marine biology from McGill University, and he was a member of the biology department at Dalhousie University from 1973 until 2008. Since his retirement, he's been active in several natural history groups, and that's an understatement, folks. In 2016, he began writing a forest blog called NS Forest Notes, and it's very popular and been very effective in calling out what's happening in this province with regards to forestry and the realities. So David has the ability, I believe, to fit details into a much larger picture that we all need to better understand. And he wanted a short introduction, and it's over to you, David. Thanks for being here tonight.
Okay, unmute, share screen.
And get me off there. Yep.
Okay, Bob. Well, I'm hoping that we'll resume at some point our. I'm sorry, I just have a little technical problem here. Just for a second. I talked back to you. Oops, one more up. Yes. Well, I'm hoping that we'll soon be able to resume those lovely celebration of nature weekends, because they were really wonderful. And we got into practice of going there with at least one of our grandchildren. And they had the kids all there, and they've really been wonderful events. And I think with this huge enrollment we have now, we might have to reserve a whole resort or something, but we look forward to those again. So anyway, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a good opportunity to try and put this all together. I have a PDF of the slides and some what I call useful links at this web address. If anybody wants to copy it down, I can make it available again. So it's www.nsforestnotes.ca/MISC/NNS. And that will have the a low res version of the slide, so it downloads quickly, and it'll have some related links and so on. Okay, of course, we speak from and about the unceded land. This sign is at the last open encampment. Probably many of you have seen it at least on Facebook. And also, whoops, wrong one. Also, Also, I want to speak of our forests as the Wabanaki forests rather than the Acadian forests, following the lead amongst the settlers of Community Forests International. I actually learned about this some years earlier from Shalane Jodry from a talk she gave at MTRI Old Forest Conference in 2016. And she has a wonderful thesis on the topic, completely available at DAL. And Shalane described the excitement she's felt when she first saw a map of the Acadian forest in Jamie Simpson's Restoring the Acadian Forest, and realized that the distribution of the Acadian forest corresponds closely to the Wabanaki territory. And you can see these overlapping lines here. The blue is Jamie's Acadian forest. The red, I believe, yeah, red is Abenaki territory. And then there's the Wabanaki Confederacy. Wabanaki means people of the dawn. And as I understand it, Wabanaki means land of the dawn, and either term are kind of interchangeable this way. And the Mi'kmaq people understood Wabanaki as the place where people first welcome the sun on behalf of the rest of the peoples of Turtle Island, which is, of course, North America. So it's really, anyway, it's a beautiful concept, and that's why I'm starting to use the term Wabanaki forest rather than Acadian forest. So Nature Nova Scotia asked me initially if I would talk about forestry issues in Nova Scotia. And I said, yes, but I want to talk more about something positive, about things to celebrate in forests, because in keeping with the celebration of nature, because how we are practicing forestry in this province is unfortunately still a long way from something to celebrate. So I came up with a kind of compromise approach and do a bit of both, which is what's in this dual title here. Forest disturbance regimes and current issues in forestry, which is what Nature NS gave it. And then I'm to celebratory part is celebrating the windy forests in Mi'kmaq. Consistent with the celebration of nature weekend, I also want to celebrate natural history in Nova Scotia, which is really transitioning into a citizen science movement. Not very long ago, Nature Nova Scotia consisted of a handful of natural history memberships, with membership and the total membership in the maybe several hundred. Now there are many more organizations, and its membership, I think, is something close to 10,000. And it's playing a very significant educational and advocacy role related to the natural world in Nova Scotia, as well as celebrating it. And we have Bob Bancroft to thank for an awful lot of that. On the citizen front, I especially want to acknowledge the handful of still existing handful of natural history organizations, MTRI, the Mersey-Tobiac Research Institute, and finally the Women of Southwest Nova Scotia, in particular Donna Crossland, Shelley Hipson, Bev Wigney, Nina Newington, and there are many, many more, believe me, who have urged us to get out and actually look at some of these crown lands and start looking at them from the point of view of natural history and with some citizen science, and to stand up for them. And that's something that's really changed significantly in the last 3 years since 2018. So I also want to celebrate a little bit of that. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'll provide a little background on forest succession and disturbance and a few definitions. Then I will introduce what I see as two major issues in forestry today. And then I will talk about my celebratory topic, the windy forests of Mi'kmaq. And we'll see how that relates to and informs those two major issues. I'm just reading the first part of this so I can get through this without too much trouble. So this is a fairly dense slide, and it's one reason I'm giving you the slide deck. Go back and study these in more detail. This diagram comes from a beautiful publication by Josh Noseworthy, the New England Acadian Forest Restoration. If you haven't seen it, you should have a look at it. I think the province should be using that manual for the practicing forestry in Nova Scotia. So it came from there, and he compiled it from other sources, and the years and so on relate really to our Wabanaki forest. So that's why I'm using it. So we know that forests undergo succession after some type of stand leveling disturbance. It could be wind or fire, or it could be a clear cut. It goes right back to the beginning, and then it goes through a succession of stages, and we get a bigger and older forest through time. And it's commonly described in terms of 4 or 5 stages. Here it's in 5, and they've got 2 categories here. There's the early successional stage here and the late successional stage. And more or less, those correspond to young forest and old forest. And that's important. And I'm going to talk a lot about old forest, and then old growth generally is considered in our region to be forests 150 years and older, but Nova Scotia gave it an age of 125, because if we started at 150, there'd even be a lot less than there is in the for bookkeeping. So we go from 125 years of age. So of course we start off with kind of a clean field and ceilings coming up. The next stage is stem exclusion, or what I like to call self-thinning. And this is the stage at which you have very dense aggregation of trees, and that's when the foresters like to go in to speed the process up and thin the stand. But that happens naturally. That will happen all on its own. And then with time, you get, initially that's an even age stand. With time, you get a new generation of trees coming up. So we start getting some stratification. Then we get into the late successional forest, the old forest, 80 years or so, we start to get a multi-layered structure. And then up to 150 years, we've got lots of dead wood and snags and all that sort of good stuff. That's when we get into old growth. So that's a succession. And then it can be interrupted by disturbances. And generally those disturbances operate more on the old forest. The old forests are more susceptible because they've started to decay, they're older and so on. And so things like wind will have more effect on those old forests. So I'm showing these stand replacing disturbances starting primarily up here. And those will take it right back to the beginning. And we divide them into 2 types: stand replacing disturbances, which can be, our main ones in Nova Scotia are wind and fire and disease and pests. But then we also have gap disturbances, which are just very localized disturbance. Typically when a single tree blows down, opens up a gap, and then you'll have a succession in that gap. And those areas are typically 24 to 126 meters in area. These go from maybe half a hectare to thousands of hectares. So we're dealing on different scales. Now let's see, what else did I want to say? I think that kind of covers it as an introduction with terms and so on. Oh, these are just some pictures to illustrate these stages. I'm sure you've all seen this. This would be a managed forest. Here's a clear cut here. And here's a forest in the stem exclusion stage. You can hardly walk through these things. And those do happen naturally, but they self-thin naturally. But that's when the foresters like to go in and thin so that they'll get their bigger trees faster. This is a gap disturbance in an old growth forest. So we've had one tree fall down. This happens to be an eastern hemlock, and there's already a yellow birch tree growing on top of it. And that will start a new successional sequence there. That's actually very important for yellow birch because it needs sun to start, but it's very tolerant. It's an old forest tree. It will grow very old. And then the bottom left, we have an old growth mixed forest as it's Sandy Lake. And you can see the multi-layered structures, there's dead wood and ground cover and everything else. And this shows you wind disturbance. These pictures were given to me by Bob Guscott. And Bob was with DNR and did the post-Hurricane Juan surveys. And these are some of the marvelous aerial photos. So they just give you an extent of the scale of these big wind disturbances. And you can see that they don't necessarily take all trees down, but they'll take most down in areas. And this gives you an idea of how these large-scale disturbances can be distributed. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the unpleasant part of the whole talk, the forest and forestry issues in Nova Scotia. And I'm going to describe them in terms of two issues. This is the way I see it. There's two major issues. And the first major issue is the question of the future of our big trees / old forests, because our big trees are in our old forests. And we make two demands on them. We want big trees for sawmills, and we want big trees for ecosystem services. And those ecosystem services are all kinds of things, but two of the ones that we realize are especially important today are biodiversity conservation and carbon storage. And the problem is that they're kind of mutually exclusive. You know, unless we let our trees grow well past 100 years old and only take a few of them for logging, then you can kind of have both. But if your trees grow to 80 years old and then you're harvesting them, you don't have any old forest. So that's kind of the conflict. And the question is, where is this going to go in future? So this is where we are currently. It's kind of an overview of where we are currently. And on the top left, we have a map of the forest development class. And the darker colors here, the dark green and the purple, you can't see this in detail here, but you get a sense of it. Those are the old forest, what are called mature forest and multi-age forest. And you notice the big concentration there is down in southwest Nova Scotia, right where West Foreign Company are want to operate right now. It's scattered through the rest of the province, but right now, that's what we have. If you go to the right, this is a map of forest volumes, and there's a direct correlation between age and volumes. Those big volume forests, they're where the old forests are. So that's the nature of the conflict. And then the bottom shows Global Forest Watch, and it's kind of the mirror image. And what's dark here are the areas that are recovering clear cuts. These are areas that have not been clear cut for a while. They're all more intact forest. So what's happened is we have a history here. We've done tremendous clear cutting in central and northern and eastern Nova Scotia. And but there's still a lot of patches of old forest, but the big concentration is in southwest Nova Scotia. And that's kind of where we are with it today. And I call this change from what we have in central and eastern Nova Scotia to what we have in southwest Nova Scotia, I call it high grading at the landscape level. Now, high grading, I'm blocking up my own description of it here. It's a term the foresters use to describe, primarily in the old days when they didn't clear cut, but they go in and take the biggest trees. And it was considered kind of the evil of traditional forestry, because you took out the biggest trees and your biggest seed trees, and it was considered to undermine the genetics and everything else. And somehow or another, modern forestry, they think that clear cutting, which takes everything out, is much better than high grading. But anyway, leave that one aside. But my point is that term is used at the stand level. And we talk about stand level, we talk about landscape level. Stand level is one cluster of forest trees that are kind of similar. And it's a polygon on these forestry maps, a section. And that term is used at the stand level, it's high grading. What I'm saying is that what we're doing is we're high grading at the landscape level. So if you look on the figure at left, it shows the Panuke Wilderness area with lots of that purple and dark green. And then to the right, Bowater Mercy Land, which has been, and all the yellow stuff is clear cut. The brown stuff is a bit older clear cut. And there's just little patches of purple and dark green there. And these little polygons here, those are planned harvests. And most of those are in those dark patches. They're almost all in those dark patches. These are some of the prescriptions. That's shelterwood, individual tree selection. They're mostly shelterwood selections here. So what's been happening is we're taking out these older forests. And especially now, you know, in COVID times when the price of lumber went up, you know, we kind of changed, and when the pulp mill closed and so on, we shifted a little bit from younger forests are pretty okay. But now they really want those older forests because the big trees are much more profitable than smaller trees. They can still make lumber from smaller trees using what they call mass timber methods. And that's the future. But when they can get large trees, they'll take them because it's more efficient all the way around. And so that's what's happening in Nova Scotia. And so the South Panuke Wilderness area gives you some idea of what the natural state of affairs is. The rest of it is what a lot of the province looks like now. So why have we not been more concerned about this loss of old forests? And part of it's an awareness problem and a monitoring problem. Now, the extent of old forest, we monitor by aerial surveillance. And there are maps available on this forest development stage, which I showed you before. They're available in the Nova Scotia Provincial Landscape Viewer. But in general, DNR, and I'm just going to call it DNR, the old term, it's now NRR, it was LNF for a while, but anyway, they don't talk about this very much. And the Harvest Plan Map Viewer, where we all go to look, see where the new harvests are, it doesn't reference these development stages. It could, it's on exactly the same platform. So it's kind of like it's there, the foresters use it, but they don't talk about it very much. So that's a problem there. The amount of wood produced, that's all publicly available. That's by the monitored by the Registry of Buyers, and it's all publicly available. So what about the other need, the ecological services? Well, carbon sequestration and storage, that is monitored by the federal government, but there are some accounting issues with it. It's too long to go into. It's just, there's some tricky accounting, and you probably read about it, and it's hard to get the real picture. And there's also, I would say, a lack of transparency. So that's a tricky one. On biodiversity, up until very recently, there's been a lack of good data on biodiversity and any link to old forests. Now, those are the two big ones, the carbon sequestration and biodiversity. There's all kinds of other ecosystem services, which are even harder to measure and hence to know what's going on. So next slide. Yeah, so I mentioned that the biodiversity part of the puzzle changed recently, and you've probably all heard about this paper that came out very recently. And it says forest degradation drives widespread avian habitat and population declines. This is an amazing paper. And it used, if you look at the bottom right, the data from 1,389 citizen scientists, bird watchers. You know, bird watchers are some of the best, most critical naturalists around for sure. And this study was all done in the Maritimes, Canada. It's a world-class study. It has world-class significance. It was done outside of government departments. It was done by academics and so on. Many authors, as you can see. And they used the database from the breeding birds, 2 breeding bird savories, and they used satellite data, and they used what data they could get from New Brunswick. Interestingly, they didn't use much from Nova Scotia for some reason to look at the distribution of old forests. And then they made models about, you know, it's all in the paper and it's kind of complicated, but they were able to show very clearly that breeding habitat losses occurred for 66% of the 54 most common bird species between 1985 and 2020. And further, that it was strongly associated with reduction in the old age classes of forest. And they're calling that forest degradation. You see, we've been focused on, when foresters and government talk about it, they like to say, oh, we don't have a problem in Canada. We don't have a problem in Nova Scotia because we don't have any deforestation. We don't, but we have forest degradation. And they never use that word. If you look on the website, very hard to find it. But this study talks about forest degradation, and that's what we're talking about when we take out that old forest because it supports so much biodiversity and carbon storage. So what I'm saying is that just within the last couple of months, the picture has changed because now we have very strong evidence, very clear evidence on this biodiversity component, even if the carbon component is a bit complicated. Okay, so what's been the response to public concerns in Nova Scotia and also concerns of the smaller forestry operators was that we had this independent review of forest practices by Professor Bill Lahey, which took place between 2017 and 2018. And I'm sure everybody knows components of it. And a big thing that they brought in with that, because they had two of the founders of this system from Maine participating in the review, Bob Seymour and Hunter, I can't remember his first name. And they conceived this concept of a triad back in the early, I think 2000s or late 1990s, I can't remember. And they were grappling with this issue of how do we get those big trees for the sawmills and how do we satisfy the ecosystem services? And they said, well, we're going to divide the land up into three portions. And we're going to have a protected portion that's nothing done on it. We're going to take some land and we're going to concentrate industrial forestry production on that land using intensive techniques. And so increase the production of big trees for sawmills on that portion of the land. So and that will reduce the need for logs from other portions of the land. That's the concept. And then the rest of the working forest is what's called the matrix. And that's where you practice ecological forestry. So that's brought into Nova Scotia. It actually only exists to any significant extent in one other area. It exists on about 800 hectares of 800 square kilometers, I think, of crown land in Quebec. And now it's proposed for Nova Scotia. This is the biggest experiment in the world. And it has a lot of press, a lot of highlights. So it's an experiment. It's not a done deal. It's an experiment. Now, without going into all the details, you hear from the government that, oh, we've got the ecological forestry part done, this SGEM. Never remember that acronym stands for, but anyway, it's the Guide for Ecological Forestry Practices in the Matrix. That's done. We're applying it. But the problem is, and that applies to the stand level. What they haven't sorted out, haven't announced, is what's happening at the landscape level. So the big unknowns I'm showing down here are the assignment of existing old forest. This is what we need to know now, to high production forestry and to the ecological matrix. We don't know that. And that's going to affect what happens to that old forest. We also don't know about the assumptions about the wood supply from crown land, high production forestry, and ecological matrix lands in successive years. And both of those factors are going to affect how much old forest we have in future. Now, Bill Lahey doesn't say a lot about old forest. He said, basically, it's a bit loose. We need to improve the abundance and conservation of old forests. It didn't provide specific targets. But they're kind of saying that, if we apply this triad and do all these things, it's all going to go right, hopefully. So the big question then is, the big issue is, this is what I'm saying, this is issue number one. Depending on how they assign these lands to high production forestry, depending on how they assign the old forest land to high production forestry and to the ecological matrix, and then depending on how much wood they're trying to get out of the crown land over successive years, that's going to determine whether the amount of old forest they have in the landscape now continues to decline, stays the same, or increases. We need it to increase. We need to reverse these declines in biodiversity. That's where we stand with this issue right now. And one thing I'm really arguing very hard for is that we need, because it's such a critical decision, this needs to be totally transparent. The public has to have access, third parties have to have access to the data, to the models, to everything for rigor of the process and for public trust in the process. So we can't accept hype from the department as we've had before, in other words, more or less I'm saying. So more or less, where are we with this now? Well, we have what do we have existing? Basically right now, you know, in British Columbia, old growth forest is very controversial because there's still a lot there, somewhere between 5 and 15%, 50% in some areas. And the logging companies want it. They say, we need this to sustain our logging companies. That's very controversial. We don't have that problem in Nova Scotia. The forest industry doesn't mind if we protect old growth forests because we only have about 0.3% by area in the whole landscape. It has no impact on wood supply if they protect that. So it's kind of this whole issue with old forests has been in my mind been kind of obscured by this thing about old growth. So we do have this old forest protection policy, and it shown on the top left. Those red dots are the points that they're protected under the old forest protection policy. Some of them, most of them are existing in protected areas. And that protects 10% of crown lands as it's potential old growth forest. Problem with it is it's the crown lands are only 1/3 of the forested lands. And the second problem is that roughly half of that forest that's protected is under 80 years old. It's not even old forest, let alone old growth forest. And just by my rough numbers, it appears that the old forest policy protects less than, I'm pretty confident in this number, less than 3% of old forest in Nova Scotia. Not very good. Now on the right, you have shows how much old forest we have. How much do we have? I don't have the numbers. DNR has them. I don't have the number. I'm guessing, I'm just eyeballing it, saying it looks about 15% to me. So we're protecting about 3%. We have about 15%. Now, how much do we want? So down on the bottom here, there's two citations of the kind of thing we want. One is this from an old paper by Mosler, and we're not going to go into the details, but they're suggesting 20 to 25% of our landscape should be maintained as these late successional forests. And on the right, we have an interesting paper that came out recently, unannounced until I asked for it, on natural disturbance regimes. And they don't say what we should be looking for, but they give an example. And their example is that if we operated forestry in 100-year rotations, over time, 37% of the landscape would be composed of stands greater than 100 years old, and 5% would be over 300 years old. So what we're looking for is something in that range, something between 20 and 37%. And pre-settler time was 40 to 50%, where it was late successional stages. So that's what we're looking for. So that's the kind of nature of the problem. Now, interestingly enough, since I've been involved in this, which has roughly been since about 2006 or 7, there's been a shift in kind of the public concerns about forests. And from roughly 2018, the concern was mainly to do with clear cutting. And, you know, the shocking big fields that were clear cut, and the Wentworth skyline and all that sort of thing. And we had the first review that Bob and Donna were involved in that got washed up. And then we got our second review, and that's the one we're trying to deal with now, which was released in 2018. Interesting, after that, the public concern shifted from clear cutting to old forests. It's shifting from clear cutting to loss of big trees in old forests. And an example of that, the first example of that was the process that the women of Southwest Nova Scotia set up at the Corbett Lake Forest in 2019. And that was an old forest, and it wasn't going to be clear cut. It was going to be uniform shelterwood harvest. And what that uniform shelterwood harvest does is shown in the bottom picture. It takes all the big trees up here. And that's what these women saw as a problem. They didn't need to see the papers to see it. In other words, the public is ahead of the departments on these things. And they were seeing exactly high grading at the landscape level. So I've got two examples here, the Corbett Lake Old Hardwood Forest. Here's the forest they're talking about. It's this patch of purple. That's what they want to take the big trees out of. And here's Beals Meadow, where they are now. I mean, look at this landscape. All the yellow is recent clear cuts. And here's the Beals Meadow, where Nina Newington and company are packed in now. And you can see these are proposed harvests. They're taking out these purple patches. So that's where that concern has shifted. And I honestly think Nina Newington, all these people are brilliant in the way they've really latched onto this and understand this problem and are focused on it. It's not about clear cutting anymore. And in this context, the Lahey process, it may or may not solve it. We're told, they said that the Corbett Lake was being done according to Lahey. They say that this one's being done according to Lahey. Why are they protesting? That's the problem, and they see that problem very clearly now. So here's a statement I just read yesterday from Nina Newington. It's just the most wonderful writer. And I won't go through it all, but she just has these lovely, lovely descriptions of what the issues are. And there you have 30 hectares are approved for clear cutting initially. Now they may be changing it to a different thing, but still taking out those big trees. And she says, the thing is, though, that when you see these remaining patches of standing forest, it's hard to imagine any prescription that takes ecological health into account, allowing for any further tree removal. And she just goes on to these marvelous descriptions on it. In the end, she says, it's time to save what we can. We need landscape level planning now before any further damage is done. So I'm just saying, I'm really, really thankful for these women and a few men out there doing that. Bob Bancroft and a few other people. Okay, so that is issue number one. Got that off my back. Issue number two, I'm not going to talk too long about because it's a complex issue. And it's basically not generally on the radar. And the issue is this map at left, those orange and red are areas of low calcium, highly acidic, high aluminum soils that exist on 60% of our landscape. And that condition is a result of inherently poorly buffered soils because of the nature of the bedrock. It's hard bedrock like granite and these slates that breaks down very slowly. It's what they say, poorly buffered soils. Then we had acid rain beginning in about 1850, washing out the nutrients, and the rocks just don't regenerate it fast enough. And then clear cutting has made the problem worse. So that's the problem we have. And this problem was recognized by aquatic biologists very early in the 1980s and 90s. And on the right shows you areas where these are salmon watersheds. In the dark areas, these things, the salmon population has been extirpated. So they've been concerned about this for a long time. The impacts on terrestrial life have not been that clear, but they are known to be reduced growth, productivity of trees, more disease and pests, habitat no longer suitable for some species of animals, thinner shells and birds, and more subtle types of things. Recently, the aquatic biologists have published a paper showing that, in most areas in North America, with controls on emissions, acid rain producing emissions, this problem has declined, but not in Nova Scotia. And it's because we have such naturally infertile systems. And the recent paper by Shannon Sterling and colleagues at Dow has described some new mechanisms by which this system kind of snaps into a condition, this low nutrient, chronically depressed condition. And it's so bad that the water in those areas is, the aluminum levels on that in those areas high enough to be harmful to human health. And they're advising people should get their well water tested. So it's not just the wildlife. The problem is it takes a long time to see this, and you probably won't see a lot of it until we cut down the trees and then they don't come back. And we are seeing that. Nina Newington seeing that up in some of the areas we're looking at. They're not coming back as quickly. So that's kind of a hidden problem. So what do we do about it? The aquatic biologists were very early into liming. First of all, they would go out and put it on the ice. Then they went into terrestrial liming, which goes into the forests. And that has a benefit for the forests, because it's, I should say that the reason the waters are acid is because the nutrients are all gone from the forest, and those used to leach out gradually and neutralize the waters. So when they lime the forest, it's a slower process, and it also raises those calcium levels, so that's a critical nutrient in the forests. And those are proven techniques, very successful. So what the foresters are proposing is that we fertilize these high production plots, and then in the ecological matrix, we're going to adjust the harvest according to nutrient budgets. So that will reduce the amount of harvesting, but it will not solve that problem in the soil. And they acknowledge that. It's kind of make it a little, not as bad, but it's not going to solve it. And my problem is that the foresters, they don't want to talk about liming. We need lime on those chronically depressed soils. You know, it's not without its problems, but it's a lot better than going on like this. And then finally, we need to reduce the amount of acid rain and then take our own steps to reduce our acid rain footprints. And most of those steps are what we do to reduce our carbon footprint. So there's a lot of overlap in that. So I just kind of want to flag this issue because it's quite complicated, but it's just kind of not very much on the radar, and it should be. So those are the two issues in forestry. And you can see I got fairly intense about it, which is, well, I didn't want to do this whole talk on those two issues because they're quite serious issues. So I'm just going to take about 30 seconds to recover, and then I'll go into the celebration part of my talk. And I want to share with you some natural history that I've been doing over the last few years. And I should say, I don't have a background in forestry. I'm a marine biologist, and most of the techniques I've been used are those of natural history and citizen science. And the area that I've been having a look at started in 2017. I was asked to do a floral survey in the lakes around Sandy Lake, Bedford. And I said, I don't want to do a floral survey, but I went out there and had a look at it. It's got these wonderful forests around it. It's between Bedford and Sackville. You can see in that picture there. And the day I went out there were Gaspereau in the shallows of the water. I went across the lake. There's a big, big peninsula. I haven't got a picture of it here. There was a cathedral stand of eastern hemlocks. I went into the forest. There were mixed Acadian forests with big old trees. And guess what? There was pit and mound topography, and that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So an absolutely wonderful area, and I agreed to have a look at it to try and help them bolster their case for conservation. And this was all done as a volunteer. This is Clarence Stevens, who's an absolutely wonderful naturalist, returning snapping turtles here. There's snapping turtles in this lake. There's not many lakes left with snapping turtles now. It's an area of, it's just above the neck of the Chebucto Peninsula, and it's an area where we go from the sort of hard exposed rocks of the Chebucto Peninsula to the rich drumlin forests of central Nova Scotia. So there's drumlin spattered all around it here. Just geologically, I wanted to give you that picture about it. And these are some areas where I did old forest assessments. Okay. And if you look at this forest development class, and they're going to talk about this, so we sort of pause and take a bit of a look at this. This is a layer on the provincial landscape viewer. And basically, the darker the colors, the older the forests. So what you can see around Sandy Lake is that there's a lot of the dark green and purple. Over here, this was clear cut in 2013. It was these colors. And the developer got pissed off because he wasn't getting the way he wanted, decided to clear cut it. But it's coming back in old forest. So this is a rich area in these older forests. And basically my tools were a tape measure, a GPS reference camera, and a hand compass. And basically I walked the whole area. This is just what I did the first summer. I've done a lot more of these red lines subsequently. And I just walk and observe, and I take notes of my little videos on the camera. I have GPS reference pictures and so on. I measure sizes of trees, directions, and yickety yak. And that's how I built up some understanding about this forest. So what I'm trying to say, these are citizen science techniques that everybody can use. And one of the things I started doing, and I'm really trying to promote this as something that people can do for citizen science, is when I was doing on these walks, anytime I'd encounter what I called a big tree, which is any tree I estimated to be 20 inches or 50 centimeters in diameter and greater, I would measure it. I would take a tape measure and go around the outside of it to get the circumference and then calculate the diameter. And after you do that for a while, you get pretty good at estimating them. So I would do that, and I would do that any tree I could see from where I was walking, which would be 10 to 20 meters from 10 to 30 meters from where I'm walking, depending on how close the stand is. And then I took those data, and initially I didn't know much about iNaturalist. Initially, I thought, how am I going to plot these data? And I found on Google Earth at the time you could do this. I could plot them as bubbles with different colors and different sizes according to the size of the trees, different colors according to the species. And that what allowed me to do is to see where there's clusters of these big trees. So I think you can see that quite distinctly here. And the reds are the eastern hemlock. You know, these colored different colors. So that was one method. This is very time consuming for me. You know, somebody who's really into GIS stuff and so on, they can do this quickly, but I can't. And then I started using iNaturalist, and it doesn't produce quite as nice maps, but it's much easier to do. So it's a bit finicky. These bubbles are different. These are actually animal bubbles for plants when they should be these bubbles. But anyway, those big trees are all there. But then you can also put pictures in. And so I have a project on iNaturalist called Big Trees. Right now I have 202 observations, 14 species, and 1 observer, because it's only my data in there. And and also the other nice thing about it is when you put in your record, and I put in the size, I put in the location it has to go in, I also put in pictures. And those pictures, you know, show habitat and everything else about it, and they'll put the track in, that sort of thing. And if I think there's some identification issues, then I'll add something like this birch. Some people might say, well, that's a white birch, and other people say it's a yellow birch. So I put a picture of the leaves in, and here on the bottom left, you can see my measurement. I put in when I estimate it and when I measure it. Because some of them I just estimate. I've got good enough that a lot of them I'm in a hurry, I just estimate it. So I can cross calibrate these things. So that's how the record's going, which is what anybody can do. And then again, what I did was, you see there's a clusters of trees here. So what I did was what I was finding was that as I went through this large area, there were patches, what looked to me like legitimate old growth. Not all through it, but patches of it. You know, the whole area had had logging done in the past, like most of our forests in Nova Scotia. But they didn't log absolutely everything. There were places left, for whatever reason, there were places left. And there's patches of old growth all through these areas. And so what I did was select 3 of these in 3 different forest types. I say, I'm going to do some tests on these, see how they qualify for old growth. So I mapped a whole bunch of these trees and then drew a polygon around it like that. And in this case, this polygon that I drew, the red one, corresponds fairly well to a DNR polygon. You know, that's what DNR is saying, a forest stand. But in some cases, they don't. So these are the data in the old, in this forest development layer. These are my polygons. This is a Google Earth. And these are the DNR polygons. And that just shows you, their maps are based on aerial photography and interpretation. They're not ground truth. I was ground truthing. So those are limitations, but also these things don't overlap. So then I wanted to know, okay, for these three areas, are these legitimate old growth forest stands? That was the question. And I got Colin Gray. I'd done a little bit of this before, but I'm not very comfortable with it. So I got Colin Gray, who was doing old forest assessments for MTRI. He came in and spent a couple of days, and we did the DNR forest assessments according to their old forest policy. And this is what we came up with. So on the top left, we had a white pine dominant stand. The oldest trees, we did the cores on three of the trees, and those were arranged 130 to 134 years. And with the other information, DNR classified as old growth. The next stand down here was hemlock dominant, 125, oldest 125 to 136, old growth. The third one was a mixed stand, 104 years to 141. It did not qualify as old growth according to DNR criteria. And then this stand was this magnificent cathedral-like stand on the peninsula that had actually been done previously by DNR protocol, and it had trees between 194 and 211 years old and this old growth. So two of these three stands were legitimate old growth according to these criteria, plus that one. So the thing that they don't qualify for, they don't qualify size-wise. They're smaller than a whole stand, and so they would not qualify, they would not formally qualify for DNR's criteria in general. And that's a problem. They're not including those. Now, I just want you to keep in mind the ages. So I also looked, this is just one tree. I looked at over here as a friend who has a cottage over here, and he's a beautiful stand of eastern hemlock. Well, we just picked a big tree and took an age. And these ages, look at the range of them here, 126 to 141 years. These ones are all 134 to 141. Older ages down here on the peninsula. So there's a cluster of these ages at around 134 to 140 years. So I just want you to keep that in mind. And now next I'm going to talk about pits and mounds. And this phenomenon called pits and mounds, I'll talk a bit more in a minute, is very characteristic of old growth forest stands. They're not mentioned in the old forest protocol for Nova Scotia, which defines old growth forest. They're not mentioned, but they're mentioned by most people who write about old forests. And this is a lovely description I have of it. I think I'll let you to read it separately. But he says this pit and mound topography occurs when old, unfortunately I can't read all my screen here. Big trees are blown down, the roots uprooted. The mound is created by the exposed root ball, the hollow where it once was. Gradually over decades, the roots rot and both the mound and the pit are colonized by mosses, et cetera, and you get this pit and mound topography in the forest. So this is from Sandy Lake at left, this rolling structure. And I'd actually learned about this from Donna and Elena Ponomarenko at that 2016 Old Forest Conference in Debert. And this is a picture of Elena and Donna. They made a slice through one of these mounds and are talking about these mound structures. And it's a really fascinating, the whole thing is, I find, a tremendously fascinating area. And just to go over it quickly, this is how the mounds are formed. And the mounds are only formed when a big tree blows down. Okay, small tree won't cut it, just doesn't make a big enough fruit ball. So the wind blows down a big tree, it falls over, as shown in number 2. It starts to decompose, and after 60 years, in number 4, you have a mound. Basically, that's it. And bottom left shows you a tree that fell over recently. This is an eastern hemlock near Grand Lake. Top right, this shows you a mound on Sandy Lake. Now, by looking at the mounds, and which is a steep side and a sloping side, you can tell which direction the tree fell in. You can also do cores and look at the amount of organic matter and figure out which direction the tree fell in. So that direction will indicate which direction the wind came from. And Donna and Alana have been promoting, they want people to do the measurements to infer wind direction of these pits and mounds, because they tell us a lot about the wind dynamics in our Nova Scotia forests. So what I decided to do was I took these 3 old growth forest stands at Sandy Lake, and they all had pits and mounds. And I said, I'm going to measure these mounds and see what the directions of windfall was on these mounds. There were also some Hurricane 1 tree fall, so a recent hurricane. So I also measured those directions. And this is with my little hand compass. And then I put it together like this. So these arrows show you the direction of tree fall, and they're mostly in this kind of little bit north-northeast to northwest-west quadrant. That's where the tree fall was occurring for the different species and the different stands. And I did some other measurements, which are up here. Now, this bothered me a little bit because, oh, I don't have it here. I missed a slide, damn it. These trees are blown down by hurricanes, and the hurricanes come up along the US coast from the southwest. And yet my diagram is showing me that the trees were falling to the northwest, whereas I'd expect it to fall to the northeast. And I thought, I don't like this. I didn't like the way it was coming out. So I sent the diagram to Donna, and Donna says, oh, you have to talk to Bob Guscott. He's been doing measurements like that at Grand Lake, which is about 30 kilometers away. Well, I got a hold of Bob, who I knew a little bit, but not that he was doing this. It turned out Bob had done almost exactly the same thing at Grand Lake and got almost exactly the same results. The trees were falling in, you can see his diagrams, they're falling in the kind of northwest to northwest quadrant, just like mine. And the explanation is that these hurricanes, as they approach from the southwest, they're rotating. And depending on which part of the rotation you happen to be in, that's going to be the direction of your tree fall. So that's why they're falling in that direction. So subsequent to that, Bob and I started to collaborating. And in fact, Bob and I and Donna and Elena started to collaborate together when we could in a little group we call the Pit and Mound Working Group. Now, we've had to interrupt it by COVID, but I'm sure we all hope to get back to it. And we go out and look at these pits and mounds in different forests across Nova Scotia. So the question is, I gotta see if I can get rid of something because I can't read my own slides here. It's some of the, whoops, what I wanted to do. Okay, how old are the mounds? Well, roughly the age of the mounds is the age of the oldest tree on the mounds plus 10 to 20 years, because you're measuring the age at 4.5 feet height, breast height, as they call it. And it maybe take 10 to 20 years, or maybe 5 to 20 years to get there. So you can estimate the age of the mounds roughly by adding the age of the oldest trees you find on the mound plus 10 to 20 years. And when I do that for those 3 stands, I get, these storms go back to 1857 to 1867. On that, for those peninsula hemlocks, they go back to the 1700s. I'm going to find that remarkable. You know, this is the mound, and going to this forest, that mound That mound was formed somewhere around between 1857 and 1867. The mounds in the big hemlock forest, cathedral hemlock forest, were formed in the 1700s. You know, really interesting. Now, this is a list of historical storms compiled in a recent paper on natural disturbances. And I've just asterisked ones that kind of correspond to these two age categories. This great storm of 1798, and then any of these storms could correspond to this cluster here, including the Saxby Gale. Okay. Now, it turns out that David Dwyer, forester at DNR, had written quite a bit about this about 30 years ago. And he wrote that in, I think this is 1979, he said a common age of forest stands in Nova Scotia is 100 years. The origin of many of these stands is blowdown resulting from the Saxby Gale. Yickety yak, and goes on like that. And then he has this diagram at right showing these different storms. And he also notes that we had storm periods and storm-free periods. And it's a really interesting thing to go on. So what Dwyer was saying was that in his observations in Nova Scotia, and that now he was saying 100 years old. Well, that was 36 or 37 years ago. So his 100-year-old trees are the same age as the ones I'm looking at, between 136 to 140 years. So that age of trees is quite common in Nova Scotia, maximum age of tree stands. And we start to find out that it's quite common. So I went to this field day at Cooks Brook in 2018. And they were talking about, they were doing some special care of this forest for a woman who wanted to do a little bit of light touch forestry, but not take the whole thing down. And they cut some of these trees. And I said, well, how old were they? And they said, well, the oldest one we found was 140 years. And when I went into the forest stand, the beautiful pits and mounds, just like I'd seen there. And now with this group, with Elena and Bob, we've seen a lot of these kinds of stands. You know, there's others that are probably different ages, but that age category is quite common. Now, I'm kind of going on a long time. Are people okay if we go a little bit longer? Am I getting any response here?
Go for it.
Are we okay?
Yeah.
I don't know how many, I'm probably losing everybody. Anyway,
Very interesting.
this this kind of when the revision of the old forest policy came out, and that old forest policy, as I mentioned before, it said old growth is any trees that are 125 years and older. Well, most of my stands would qualify there, but this new policy said some of the stands have to be 140 years. I said, that's a problem, because a lot of these 140-year-old stands, under the way you do this protocol for old growth forests, are not going to qualify under that, because it's the average age. They're not going to qualify. And that's a problem. So I wanted to demonstrate it. And I remembered that, you know, there was this controversy about cutting old growth in eastern Nova Scotia. And DNR went in and did a study on it. The alarm was raised by Danny George and other people and said, they're cutting old growth. DNR said, no, we're not doing that. They said, yes, you are. CBC went in. Finally, eventually they went in, they did quite a thorough study. They published a report, and in the appendix of that report, there's a whole bunch of ages of trees, and look at them. There's a lot in that older age category. So I took that data and I did this. I just ordered them from older to youngest. So these are the oldest trees, and they're calling recruitment dates. And what you see is, you see a plateau in this area here, in that same area that I'm finding my trees. And there's another one in here, this older one. What I'm saying is this just shows that that age is very, very common. It's a very common. So one reason we don't get really, really old forests in Nova Scotia is the winds. They tend to blow them down. This is a very windy province. So we don't get a lot of these 500-year-old trees. Now this just shows you that, anyway, I won't go into this. It's in some of the documents that are on my website and so on. The problem is if they apply this newly proposed technique to classifying old growth, it's not going to include a lot of those old stands, which are legitimate old growth stands because of a quirk in because they're not recognizing this wind disturbance problem and these, this limitation by winds, and that you have maximum age of 140 years. So it's an important issue. And what I'm trying to show you is that is kind of elaborated just by going out and looking at things, doing simple measurements and doing some citizen science, and then making a bit of a fuss about it. So I'm now getting closer to the end. So the pit and mound process is really an integral part of our forest processes. And a question, kind of rhetorical question I ask is, if an old growth forest blows down, is it still old growth? Like those big sweeps of trees you saw fell down. And one day they qualify as old growth, the next day they don't. So what's going to happen? Is DNR going to take them, stop protecting them because they've blown down? They would if they salvaged harvest them. And so my answer to that question is yes, they're still old growth as long as you don't remove the blowdown. So in other words, this forest with all this blowdown, no really old trees, to me is as old, much old growth as a tree with the big old growth stands. It's just part of the concept I'm trying to convey about it, which is really a natural history concept. Now these pits and mounds, they also have many natural values. When they fall over, they leave a pit, which serves as, many of them serve as vernal ponds for a period, very important for amphibians especially. They can also provide, depending on how they fall and so on, they can provide animal shelter and hibernacula for bears, for example. These stumps and mounds are preferred habitats for many trees and other plants. And one phenomenon I found was really interesting was the frequent co-occurrence of yellow birch and eastern hemlock, which I call the Acadian forest love affair, and I'm calling Wabanaki love affair. And I'll give you lots of references for that if you want to follow it up. Really interesting story. The thing is that in natural systems, where you have these pits and mounds, that's where things tend to grow. When we cut down the big trees, you don't have mounds anymore. You don't have those natural processes. I also think that, we hear a lot, we've heard a lot about the mother tree hypothesis and about all these wonderful fungi and so on. Well, those fungi have all got to be in those mounds. So those mounds are reservoir of a very ancient microflora that transitions from one forest to the next if we keep those mounds. So they're integral to this whole process. And finally, I found myself, when I understood, when I recognized what these pits and mounds were and understood what they were, to me, it changed the way I felt the forest. And it's kind of when you're walking around it, you feel like you're walking with the elders. The existing trees are living with the elders, and we're walking amongst the elders. So I think it has these many, many values. And another point about it is that they're somewhat special to Nova Scotia. Because of all of these very infertile soils, very little in Nova Scotia was ever turned into agriculture. In northeastern North America, it was almost all turned to agriculture. It then was abandoned, and now they have these magnificent, beautiful forests, but they don't have pits and mounds. We still have a lot of pit and mound topography in Nova Scotia. And what I'm saying is that we need to value it for its own sake and all these processes, and because it's very special. Just a little reminder of what the pit and mound looks like. And then this kind of spiritual value, I think, is something we're realizing more and more with COVID and so on. Will Brunner's a wonderful guy. I heard a talk he gave back in the fall on forest bathing. He's a fisheries biologist who worked with the Sackville Rivers Association, went back to Ontario, got involved in this forest bathing thing, got qualified in it, and came back to Nova Scotia and wants to conduct a business in it. And it basically involves going into the forest and letting it surround you and sort of take your mind away and just solve all kinds of issues. And I just think it's a wonderful, that just all these wonderful uses of the forest that we need to value. And wow, that's the end. So, sorry, I've gone on a long time. Anybody there?
Here, David, and it's Bob Bancroft here, and don't apologize. You've done an excellent job, sir.
We had virtual clapping.
Anyway.
If you have any questions, folks, you can go ahead and stick them in the chat there. David, I can start you off with a question if you have time. I'm wondering where, because you're kind of preaching to the choir here about things that need to be done next. And a lot of the folks here tonight are already taking those next steps and are acting as citizen scientists to report these areas and do all that stuff. So I'm wondering what it would take to mobilize the average Nova Scotian to do this kind of work that you're calling for. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think, that's what Bev Whitney, Bev, she really started it in my mind. She's the one who said, I think in 2018, she said, we got to go and look at some of these crown lands. And she started it. And then, Nina Newington and that group, I mean, what they're doing up there in Beals Brook and everything is wonderful. They did it at Corbett Lakes. And, I'm not saying Pits and Mounds is the whole story. It's part of the story. It's citizen science. I'm presenting it tonight because I wanted to celebrate something. But like Nina's doing, people learning about lichens. And then I'm saying, just tape measure and measuring trees and putting them on iNaturalist, you can start to see things about the forest that are important. So I think this is happening. And I guess, we all have to think about how we can kind of mobilize and do it.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
I'm just trying to go through our chat here, which is moving really quick and hard to keep up with. A lot of thank you in the chat, David, for your excellent presentation. There's a lot of detail in there. You've got a volunteer, says count me in if you ever need help collecting more data. And there's a good reminder in the chat actually from Karen. So tomorrow and Sunday, no, just tomorrow, Karen is leading 2 hikes to Sandy Cove. And I think there's still space in both
Sandy Lake.
Yeah, to Sandy Lake. Yeah. Sandy Lake. So there's still space in both. I'm pretty sure if you're interested in seeing firsthand what Dave's talking about there with the pit and mountain topography. So cool.
Yeah, and Karen's been wonderful. She's kind of taken over from me because I had some issues that I can't do that quite as intensively as I used to. But Karen really understands all of these processes and a lot more very well. So, and Sandy Lake just happens to be an area that's very accessible to look at this stuff. And you have all the flavors of the Wabanaki forest there. Every major tree, even this guy and this Will Brunner, I was standing next to him and he said, Dave, do you have ironwood in these forests? And I said, Will, I said, there's very little ironwood left in Nova Scotia. I said, there's, a lot up around Windsor and a few places like that. I said, no, we don't have it here. I kind of dismissed it. Within 5 minutes, he said, Dave, look at that tree. It was an ironwood tree. And this was in January, and there just happened to be a few leaves left hanging. And I thought, my God, he's right, because I had thought it was an ash tree. The bark is kind of similar at that particular size. And there are a few ash trees in there, and I kind of stopped looking at them because I verified they were ash trees. And there was ironwood tree in there. the tree in there. Anyway, I don't know how I got on that story.
Cool spot.
Yeah, I was just saying that Sandy Lake has all flavors of the Wabanaki Forest in it. It's a really wonderful place to see these things. And I'm willing to do more walks there. I think I told Rebecca that I'm willing to do some walks there during the summer to say my condition is a little better.
Well, we'll definitely be in touch. So we ended up having to cancel our Peggy's Cove walk this weekend too, just because the top of the Barren is a little bit windy and wet, or will be tomorrow.
No.
Yeah, so we'll probably do a couple things over the summer, and it'd be great to get some folks out into some representative forest types. I did post some links, folks, at the very top of the chat. If you scroll like all the way up to the top again, where you can see Dave's blog and his forest notes. So definitely check that out. There's a particular link there for the Wabanaki Forest post, but there's a whole bunch of other cool stuff on there. Give it a read if you haven't already. Is the big tree search still ongoing?
I think Bob would have to answer that.
You there, Bob?
There are several big tree searches going on in this province. There's one fellow down near Bridgewater who's doing it, and Larry Bulgan has been doing it with Nature Nova Scotia, and there may be another one, David, that I'm not aware of, because that's something that happens with me.
Well, there was the Forest Technicians Association Nova Scotia, which kind of had the official site for a long time. And for some reason, they blocked me from visiting that site, if you can believe it. They specifically blocked my computer from accessing that site because I wanted to post something on their big tree thing. I couldn't do it.
Isn't that sad?
That made me laugh, actually. I just found that amusing. I'm still blocked. They don't accept me there.
Well, you know, you're such a heretic now, eh?
Well, you know, Bob.
You're good company, David.
Yeah. But I really encourage people, you know, big tree, just start measuring a few, and pretty soon you'll get around to recognizing when a tree's around 20 inches or bigger. And when you see one, you know, with your cell phones, it's really easy. Take a picture of it, upload it to iNaturalist and get a location of it. Take a few habitat shots and put there with it. I think that's very valuable information. Very simply done.
This is Larry Bogan.
Yes, Larry.
On iNaturalist, there is a project for the big trees of Nova Scotia. So if you do put it on iNaturalist,
I didn't know that.
make sure you join the big tree project so that it goes over to the project.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Yeah.
All right, folks. Well, if there's no more questions, then I guess we can wrap up there. Bob, did you want to say anything else before we let folks go?
Oh, I think you've done a great job, and I want to just say thanks to you, David, for a most informative keynote speach.
Okay. Well, you know, I have posted the set of slides, and I realize it's pretty dense. And I think you're recording this session, so I hope, you know, between those slides and so on, will give people more time to go over and look at some of those things if they want to do that. And thank you very much. It's an honor to speak to this group.
Have a good evening.
Thank you,
Thank you.
David.
Thank you.
All right. Well, folks, for those of you who are field tripping tomorrow, enjoy your trips. Stay dry. Take pictures and tag us. Tell us what you're seeing or hearing if you're birding. And we'll see you back on our virtual screen tomorrow night. Right. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Hey.